Sometimes the most precious gifts come from the smallest hands, reminding us that wisdom isn't always found in age. In quiet neighborhoods where porches hold stories and children still learn from their elders, miracles can unfold in the most ordinary moments. 7-year-old Zora Williams spent her summer days in her grandfather's garage, learning about engines while other kids played games. Miss Darlene, the tired nurse who worked long shifts at the hospital, always stopped by with crackers for the neighborhood children. On this particular afternoon, Zora noticed something dangerous under Miss Darlene's old car, a gas leak that could have cost the kind woman her life. When the little girl bravely spoke up with her warning, neither of them knew this moment would spark a friendship that would heal two broken hearts. Both were carrying invisible burdens, Zora missing her late mother and Darlene struggling with loneliness and burnout. How could one child's sharp eyes and caring heart change everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Maple Street, where houses sat comfortable distances apart and neighbors still waved from their front porches. This was the kind of place where children rode bicycles without helmets and adults left their doors unlocked, where the ice cream truck's melody could summon kids from 3 blocks away. At the end of the street, where the pavement gave way to gravel and the houses grew more spread out, stood the Williams place, a modest 2-story home with a wraparound porch and a detached garage that had seen better days. Inside that garage, surrounded by the comfortable clutter of decades, Earl Williams watched his granddaughter work with the focused intensity of someone 3 times her age. Zora sat cross-legged on the concrete floor, a disassembled lawnmower engine spread before her like pieces of a mechanical puzzle. Her small hands, already stained with grease despite her grandfather's attempts to keep her clean, moved with surprising confidence as she examined each component. "Now what do you reckon's wrong with this old thing?" Earl asked, settling into his favorite folding chair. At 72, he moved with the careful deliberation of a man who'd spent 40 years under the hoods of cars, his back bearing the permanent curve of someone who'd bent over engines more often than he'd stood straight. Zora picked up a spark plug, holding it up to the light streaming through the garage's single window. "The electrode's all black and crusty, Grandpa. Mama used to say—" She stopped herself, the words catching in her throat the way they still did, even 3 months after the funeral. Earl's expression softened. "What did your mama used to say, sweetheart?" "She said dirty things can't do their job right. That's why she always washed her hands so much at the hospital." Zora's voice grew quieter. "She said keeping things clean was part of taking care of people." The garage fell silent, except for the distant hum of Mrs. Patterson's air conditioner and the occasional car passing on Maple Street. Earl reached into his toolbox, a battered red Craftsman that had been his companion since 1975, and pulled out his worn wrench set. The metal showed the patina of countless repairs, each tool shaped by years of honest work. "Your mama was right about that," he said, handing Zora a wire brush. "Clean that plug up real good, and we'll see if this old mower's got another summer left in it." Zora took the brush and began working with the methodical patience Earl had taught her. She'd been living with him since the accident, since that rainy night when a drunk driver had taken away the only parent she'd ever known. Sarah Williams had been driving home from a double shift at County General, tired but content after helping deliver twins to a young couple who'd tried for years to have children. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the neighborhood. A woman who'd dedicated her life to healing, taken by someone who couldn't be bothered to call a cab. "Tell me about the fuel system again," Zora said, not looking up from her work. Earl knew this routine by now. When the sadness crept in, she threw herself into learning, as if understanding how things worked could somehow make sense of why they sometimes broke beyond repair. "Well, see, it's like this," Earl began, moving to kneel beside her despite his creaking joints. "The gas tank's like the heart, pumping fuel through these little arteries. We call them fuel lines. But if there's a leak anywhere in the system, the engine can't get what it needs to run. Or worse, that leaked fuel could find a spark and boom." Zora finished, finally looking up with eyes that held too much understanding for a 7-year-old. "That's right. That's why we always check for leaks first thing. Safety before everything else." The sound of a car door slamming drew their attention to the street. Through the open garage door, they could see Miss Darlene stepping out of her aging Honda Civic. The car's blue paint faded to an uncertain grey-green. She moved with the careful weariness of someone who'd just finished a 16-hour shift, her scrubs wrinkled and her shoulders carrying the weight of too many difficult decisions. Darlene Washington had been making this weekly pilgrimage to Maple Street for 2 months now, ever since Sarah's funeral when she'd promised Earl she'd check in on them. At 55, she'd been a nurse for over 30 years, long enough to have delivered half the babies in town and held the hands of their grandparents when they passed. She lived alone in a tidy apartment across town, her only regular visitors being the potted plants she talked to and the stray cat she pretended not to feed. "Afternoon, Earl. Hey there, Zora," she called out, reaching into her back seat for a familiar white bag. "I brought those peanut butter crackers you like." Zora's face brightened, the first genuine smile Earl had seen from her all day. She carefully set down her tools and wiped her hands on the old towel Earl kept hanging from his workbench. "What are you working on today?" Darlene asked, approaching with the easy familiarity of someone who'd become part of their routine. She peered at the engine parts with genuine interest, though her expertise lay in fixing people rather than machines. "Teaching her about fuel systems," Earl replied, accepting the bag of crackers with a grateful nod. "She's got a natural talent for seeing how things fit together." Darlene studied Zora's work, noting the careful organization of parts and the girl's obvious concentration. "Your mother had that same gift," she said quietly. "She could look at a patient and somehow know exactly what they needed, even when they couldn't tell her themselves." The mention of her mother didn't sting as much when Miss Darlene said it. Maybe it was because Darlene had worked alongside Sarah, had seen her in action at the hospital, where she'd been known for her gentle touch with pediatric patients and her ability to calm worried parents with just a few well-chosen words. "Did you know my mama when she was little like me?" Zora asked, settling back down with her spark plug and a fresh cracker. Darlene smiled, a real smile that reached her tired eyes. "No, sweetheart. I met her when she started working at the hospital, about 5 years ago, but you know what? She talked about you all the time. How smart you were, how you loved taking things apart and putting them back together. She was so proud of you." Earl watched this exchange with the quiet satisfaction of someone seeing puzzle pieces fall into place. He'd been worried about Zora's isolation, the way she'd retreated into books and mechanical projects since the funeral, but something about Darlene's visits seemed to draw her out, to remind her that the world still held people who cared. "Miss Darlene," Zora said, looking up from her work with sudden curiosity, "do you ever fix things at the hospital? Like broken things?" "All the time," Darlene replied, settling onto an overturned milk crate that had become her unofficial seat. "During these visits, sometimes it's equipment, monitors that won't beep right, or IV pumps that get stubborn. But mostly I fix people, or at least try to help them fix themselves. That's like what Grandpa does, except with cars instead of people." "You're absolutely right. Your grandfather and we're both in the fixing business." Darlene glanced at Earl with a knowing look, "though I bet he's better with carburetors than I am." Earl chuckled. And I bet you're better with hearts than I am, the human kind anyway. As the afternoon wore on, they fell into an easy rhythm. Earl guided Zora through reassembling the engine, while Darlene asked questions that showed genuine interest in their work. She told them stories from the hospital, carefully edited for a 7-year-old audience, about the satisfaction of helping someone feel better, about the teamwork required to save lives. "The thing is," Darlene said, watching Zora carefully thread a bolt back into place, "whether you're fixing an engine or helping a patient, it all comes down to paying attention, really looking at what's in front of you and asking the right questions." Zora nodded solemnly. "Grandpa says the engine tells you what's wrong if you know how to listen." "People are the same way," Darlene replied. "They tell you what they need, even when they don't use words." As the sun began to sink lower, casting the garage in warm golden light, Darlene reluctantly stood to leave. She had an early shift the next morning, and the drive across town seemed longer each week. "Same time next week?" she asked, as she had every week for the past 2 months. "We'll be here," Earl replied, as he had every week in response. But this week, Zora looked up from her work with something new in her expression, a spark of connection that hadn't been there before. "Miss Darlene," she called out, as the nurse reached her car. "Next week, can you tell me more about the fixing people part?" Darlene paused with her hand on the car door, surprised by the directness of the question. "I'd be happy to, sweetheart." As her taillights disappeared down Maple Street, Earl noticed something different about the way Zora returned to her work. There was purpose in her movements now, a sense of looking forward to something beyond just the mechanical puzzle in front of her. That night, as he tucked her into bed, Zora asked the question that had been building all afternoon. "Grandpa, do you think Mama would want me to help people like Miss Darlene does?" Earl smoothed the covers around his granddaughter, choosing his words carefully. "I think your mama would want you to follow your heart, wherever it leads you, whether that's fixing engines or helping people, or something we haven't even thought of yet." "What if I wanted to do both?" Earl kissed her forehead, tasting the familiar mixture of soap and lingering traces of the garage's honest scents. "Then I'd say you're your mother's daughter, and there's no limit to what you can do." As Zora drifted off to sleep, Earl stood in her doorway, thinking about the changes he'd witnessed that afternoon. For the first time since the funeral, his granddaughter seemed to be looking beyond her grief, reaching toward something that might eventually become hope. Outside, the neighborhood settled into its evening quiet, porch lights flickering on one by one. Somewhere across town, Darlene Washington was probably getting ready for another early morning, another day of healing and helping at County General. And in the morning, the garage would be waiting, filled with the promise of new lessons and the growing certainty that some of the best repairs happened not to machines, but to hearts that had almost forgotten how to hope. 3 weeks later, the heat of mid-July had settled over Maple Street like a familiar blanket, sending most folks indoors during the peak afternoon hours. But in Earl's garage, Zora had discovered that the concrete floor stayed cool, and the cross breeze through the open doors made it the perfect place to work on her latest project. A small transistor radio that had belonged to her mother. She'd been at it for an hour, carefully removing the back panel and studying the maze of wires and circuits inside, when she heard the familiar sound of Miss Darlene's car turning into their driveway. But something was different today. The engine sputtered and coughed before settling into an uneven idle that made Zora look up from her work. Through the garage opening, she watched Darlene park in her usual spot near the front porch. The nurse sat in the driver's seat for a moment, longer than usual, her shoulders sagging with exhaustion that seemed to go deeper than just a long shift. When she finally got out, Zora noticed she moved even more carefully than usual, one hand pressed to her lower back. "Afternoon, Miss Darlene," Zora called out, setting down her tiny screwdriver. Your car sounds sick. Darlene managed a tired smile as she retrieved her usual bag of treats from the back seat. Hello, sweetheart. Yes, it's been making that noise for a few days now. I keep meaning to take it to a mechanic, but she shrugged, the gesture speaking volumes about time and money and the endless demands of a job that never really ended. Earl emerged from the house where he'd been fixing a leaky faucet, wiping his hands on an old towel. Darlene, you look worn down to the bone. Rough week? We lost Mrs. Henderson yesterday, she replied quietly, knowing Earl would remember the elderly woman who'd lived on Oak Street until her hip surgery complications had sent her to County General. And we've been short-staffed since Jenkins moved to Atlanta. I've been pulling doubles just to keep the ward covered. Zora had returned to her radio, but her ears were tuned to the adult conversation. She'd learned that grown-ups often said important things they thought children weren't listening to. But as she worked, another sound caught her attention, a soft hissing that seemed to be coming from the direction of Miss Darlene's car. At first, she thought it might be the air conditioning settling, or maybe a tire losing pressure. But something about the sound nagged at her, reminding her of the lesson Grandpa had taught her about fuel systems just a few weeks ago. The memory of his words came back clearly. If there's a leak anywhere in the system, the engine can't get what it needs to run. Or worse, that leaked fuel could find a spark and boom. Quietly, she set down the radio and walked toward Darlene's car. The hissing was definitely coming from underneath the vehicle, and now she could smell something sharp and chemical that made her think of the gas station where Grandpa sometimes let her help him fill up his truck. Crouching down, she peered under the car's rear end. What she saw made her stomach tighten with recognition and worry. A thin stream of liquid was dripping steadily from what looked like a rubber hose, forming a small but growing puddle on the hot asphalt. The liquid was clear, and the smell was unmistakably gasoline. Zora's mind raced through everything Grandpa had taught her about fuel systems. Gas leak plus hot engine plus any little spark equals disaster. She thought about Miss Darlene's long drive home, about busy intersections and cigarettes, and all the things that could create that one dangerous spark. For a moment she hesitated. Adults didn't always like being told things by children, especially about their own cars. What if she was wrong? What if Miss Darlene thought she was just playing around, pretending to know things she didn't really understand? But then she remembered her mother's nursing badge, the one Grandpa kept in his dresser drawer. She'd found it while helping him organize his room, and when she'd asked about it, he'd told her that her mother had lived by a simple rule. When you see someone in danger, you speak up, even if it's uncomfortable, even if you might be wrong. Taking a deep breath, Zora stood up and walked over to where Darlene and Earl were discussing the challenges of understaffing at the hospital. "Miss Darlene," she said, her voice smaller than she'd intended, "I think there's something wrong with your car." Both adults turned to look at her, and Zora felt her cheeks grow warm under their attention. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Darlene asked gently. "There's gas leaking underneath it. A lot of gas, and it's making a puddle." Earl's expression immediately shifted to concern. "Show me," he said, following Zora to the car. The three of them crouched down together, and even Darlene could see the steady drip of fuel and smell the sharp odor that was now noticeable in the still air. "Good Lord," Earl muttered, standing up quickly. "Darlene, how long has your car been making those rough sounds?" "Like I said, a few days." "Why? Is it serious?" Earl was already moving toward his toolbox. "It's serious enough. That fuel line's rotted through, and you've been driving around with a tank full of gas dripping onto your hot exhaust system." "Zora, step back from the car. Actually, let's all step back." The urgency in his voice sent a chill through the afternoon heat. Darlene followed Earl's lead, moving away from the vehicle as the full implication of what Zora had discovered began to sink in. "You mean I could have—" Darlene started. Could have had a fire, yes. Or worse. Earl was already on his phone, calling his old friend Mike, who ran the service station down on Main Street. "Mike, it's Earl Williams. I need you to come out to my place with your tow truck and bring your emergency kit." While Earl made arrangements, Darlene knelt down beside Zora, her expression a mixture of amazement and gratitude. "How did you know to look under there?" she asked. Zora shrugged, suddenly shy again, now that the immediate crisis had been identified. "It sounded wrong, and Grandpa taught me that fuel leaks are dangerous. I thought someone should check." "You thought right," Darlene said softly. "Zora, do you understand what you just did?" The little girl shook her head, not sure what Miss Darlene meant. "You might have saved my life. If I'd driven home tonight with that leak, if I'd stopped for gas, or if someone had been smoking nearby." Darlene's voice caught. "You saw something that needed attention, and you were brave enough to speak up about it." Within 20 minutes, Mike's tow truck was pulling into the driveway, and the mechanic was confirming what Earl and Zora had already determined. The fuel line had deteriorated to the point where it was not just leaking, but on the verge of complete failure. "Another few miles and this whole thing could have gone up," Mike said, shaking his head as he prepared to load the Honda onto his truck. "Kids got sharp eyes. Most adults wouldn't have noticed that leak until it was too late." As they watched Darlene's car being towed away for emergency repairs, the three of them stood in the driveway, processing what had almost happened. "I don't know how to thank you," Darlene said to Zora. "Both of you." "Don't thank me," Earl replied. This was all Zora. She's the one who noticed, and she's the one who had the courage to say something. Zora looked up at Miss Darlene, seeing something new in the nurse's expression, a kind of respect that she'd never seen an adult direct toward her before. "Grandpa says when you see something wrong, you have to try to fix it," she said simply. "Your grandfather's a wise man," Darlene replied, "and so are you." That evening, after Darlene had called a cab to get home and made arrangements to pick up her car the next day, Earl and Zora sat on the front porch watching the fireflies begin their nightly dance. "You did good today, little one," Earl said, pulling Zora closer to his side. "Real good. I was scared she might think I was being silly. But you spoke up anyway. That's what courage is, being scared but doing the right thing despite the fear." Zora was quiet for a moment, processing the events of the day. "Grandpa, do you think this is what Mama meant about taking care of people?" Earl considered the question carefully. "I think your mama would say that taking care of people comes in all kinds of forms. Sometimes it's bandaging a cut or giving medicine. Sometimes it's fixing a broken engine so someone can get to work. And sometimes it's just paying attention and caring enough to speak up when something's not right. So I was kind of like a nurse today." "You were exactly like a nurse today," Earl said, and in his voice Zora could hear the pride and love that made the day's scary moments worth it. As they sat together in the gathering darkness, neither of them could have predicted how this afternoon's crisis would change the relationship between a lonely nurse and a grieving child. But already something had shifted. Zora had discovered that her mechanical knowledge could be used to help people, and Darlene had seen firsthand the sharp intelligence and caring heart that Zora Williams had nurtured in her daughter. Tomorrow would bring new lessons and deeper conversations. But tonight, in the quiet of Maple Street, a 7-year-old girl who had lost her mother had learned something precious about herself. She had the power to keep other people safe, and sometimes that power came disguised as simply paying attention and caring enough to act on what she saw. 2 days after the fuel line incident, Darlene returned to Maple Street with her repaired Honda and something else, a small white envelope with Zora's name written in careful cursive across the front. She found the girl exactly where she expected to, cross-legged on the garage floor with a different project spread before her. This time it was an old electric fan that Earl had rescued from a neighbor's trash pile, its metal blades dusty, but still intact. "Knock, knock," Darlene called out as she approached the open garage door. "Is there a certain mechanical genius available for visitors?" Zora looked up, her face breaking into a grin that made Darlene's chest tighten with unexpected warmth. "Miss Darlene, how's your car feeling?" "Much better, thanks to you. Mike said the whole fuel system needed updating, but at least I didn't have to find out the hard way." Darlene held out the envelope. "I brought you something to say, thank you." Zora set down her screwdriver and wiped her hands on her shorts before accepting the envelope. Inside was a card she'd clearly made herself, construction paper cut into the shape of a wrench, with "thank you" written in silver marker and a small photograph glued beneath the words. The photo showed a much younger Darlene in crisp white scrubs, standing beside a hospital bed where a little boy was holding up a toy car for the camera. Both Darlene and the child were smiling. "That's Tommy Henderson," Darlene explained, settling onto her milk crate seat. "This was about 10 years ago when he was in for pneumonia. He was so scared of all the medical equipment, but when I told him the heart monitor was just like a car engine, it needed to beep regularly to show everything was running right, he started to relax. His mom brought that toy car from home, and he insisted on fixing it while he got better." Zora studied the photograph with interest. "Did he get well?" "He did. He's in high school now, actually thinking about studying engineering in college." Darlene paused. "The thing is, Zora, that little boy taught me something important that day. Sometimes the best way to help someone is to connect what they're going through to something they already understand and care about. Like how Grandpa explains everything using car parts." "Exactly like that. Your grandfather has a gift for taking complicated things and making them make sense." Darlene watched as Zora carefully propped the handmade card against Earl's toolbox, where she could see it while she worked. "Speaking of which, what are you working on today?" Zora's enthusiasm bubbled over as she gestured toward the disassembled fan. "Grandpa found this in Mrs. Chen's trash, but I think it just needs cleaning and maybe a new cord. See how the motor housing isn't cracked, and the blades spin freely when you turn them by hand?" Darlene leaned forward, genuinely interested. "Show me how you can tell." For the next 20 minutes, Zora walked Darlene through her diagnostic process, explaining how she'd learned to identify problems by looking, listening, and testing each component. Her small hands moved confidently through the parts, pointing out signs of wear and areas that needed attention. "This is fascinating," Darlene said. "You know, there are similarities between what you're doing and what I do at the hospital." "Really? How?" "Well, when a patient comes in, I have to figure out what's wrong by asking questions and looking for clues, just like you're doing with this fan. I check vital signs. That's like testing whether the motor turns freely. I listen to their breathing and heartbeat. That's like listening for unusual sounds. And I look for symptoms that might tell me what's causing their problems." Zora's eyes lit up with understanding. "So people are kind of like machines that need fixing sometimes?" "In some ways, yes. Though people are much more complicated because we have feelings and fears and memories that can affect how we heal." Darlene picked up one of the fan blades, examining it thoughtfully. "But the basic idea is the same. Pay attention, ask questions, and use what you know to help." Earl appeared in the garage doorway, having heard the tail end of their conversation. "Sounds like you two are sharing trade secrets," he said, settling into his folding chair with a satisfied grunt. Miss Darlene was explaining how fixing people is like fixing machines, Zora said, "except people have feelings." "That's right," Earl nodded. "Though I'll tell you something interesting, Zora. Sometimes machines have personalities too. I've worked on cars that seemed stubborn or cranky, and others that practically fixed themselves once you showed them a little kindness." Darlene laughed. "I know exactly what you mean. Some of our medical equipment definitely has moods. There's one IV pump on the 3rd floor that only works properly if you talk to it nicely first." See, Earl grinned at his granddaughter. Everything responds better to patient, caring attention. As the afternoon progressed, their conversation naturally flowed between mechanical and medical topics. Darlene found herself sharing stories from the hospital, always carefully choosing ones appropriate for young years, while Zora demonstrated various repair techniques she'd learned. "You know what I love about your approach?" Darlene observed, as she watched Zora carefully clean each fan blade. "You're not rushing. You're taking time to understand what you're working with before you try to fix it. Grandpa says hurrying leads to mistakes, and mistakes can be dangerous." He's absolutely right. In nursing, we have a saying, measure twice, cut once. It means being thorough and careful is always better than being fast and careless. Zora paused in her cleaning. "Is that why you work such long hours? Because you have to be careful with so many people?" The question caught Darlene off guard with its perceptiveness. "That's part of it, yes. When you're responsible for people's health and safety, you can't take shortcuts. But don't you get tired and lonely?" Earl shot his granddaughter a look. Sometimes her directness could venture into territory that made adults uncomfortable, but Darlene seemed more thoughtful than offended. "I do get tired," she admitted. "And yes, sometimes I get lonely. When you spend all day taking care of other people, it can be hard to remember to take care of yourself." "Is that why you like coming here?" Darlene considered the question seriously. "I think I like coming here because you and your grandfather remind me that there are different ways to help people, and because—" She hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Because it's nice to have somewhere to go where someone is happy to see me just because I'm me, not because they need something fixed or healed." Zora nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "Grandpa says everyone needs a place where they can just be themselves." "Your grandfather is a very wise man." As the afternoon began to cool, Darlene found herself reluctant to leave. There was something peaceful about the garage, about the methodical process of taking things apart and putting them back together, about the easy conversation that flowed between 3 generations. "Miss Darlene," Zora said as they began to put away tools, "would you like to help me test the fan when I get it back together? I mean, if you want to learn more about the fixing machines part?" "I would love that," Darlene replied, and was surprised by how much she meant it. "And maybe I could learn more about the fixing people part. I mean, I know I'm too little to be a real nurse, but maybe there are things I could understand." Darlene looked at Earl, who nodded encouragingly. "I think there are definitely things you could understand, and I think your mama would be proud to know you're interested in helping people feel better." As Darlene prepared to leave, she realized something had shifted in these past few hours. What had started as a simple thank you visit had become something richer, a genuine exchange of knowledge and perspectives between a seasoned nurse and a curious child. "Same time next week?" Earl asked, as had become their tradition. "Actually," Darlene said, surprising herself, "would it be all right if I came by before then? Maybe this weekend? I'd like to see how the fan project turns out." Zora's face lit up. "Really? You want to come back just to see a fan?" "I want to come back to spend time with my friends," Darlene corrected gently. "The fan is just a bonus." Driving home that evening, Darlene reflected on the conversation she'd had about loneliness. She hadn't intended to be so honest with a 7-year-old, but there was something about Zora's direct questions and genuine concern that invited truthfulness. For the first time in months, she found herself looking forward to the weekend, not because it meant a break from work, but because it meant returning to a place where her presence was wanted rather than just needed. It was a small distinction, but as she'd learned in 30 years of nursing, sometimes the smallest changes could make the biggest difference in how someone felt about their life. That night, As Zora showed Earl the handmade card and recounted her conversation with Miss Darlene, she asked the question that had been building all afternoon. "Grandpa, do you think Miss Darlene needs fixing too? I mean, not like a machine, but like maybe she needs someone to pay attention to her the way she pays attention to sick people." Earl pulled his granddaughter close, marveling once again at her ability to see straight to the heart of things. "I think that's a very wise observation, little one, and I think you might be just the person to help with that kind of fixing." Saturday arrived with the kind of perfect August morning that made people remember why they loved small towns. Clear skies, gentle breeze, and the promise of a day unhurried by the demands of work and school. Zora had been up since sunrise, puttering around the garage and checking her progress on the electric fan for the third time. She'd successfully cleaned all the components, replaced the frayed electrical cord with one Earl had salvaged from an old lamp, and reassembled the motor housing. All that remained was the final test to see if her diagnosis and repair work had been successful. When Darlene arrived at 10 o'clock, she found Zora pacing nervously around the garage, while Earl prepared his workbench for the moment of truth. "Someone's excited," Darlene observed, settling into her now familiar spot on the milk crate. "I'm scared it won't work," Zora admitted. "I think I did everything right, but what if I missed something?" "That's normal," Darlene reassured her. "I feel that way every time I try a new treatment or use a piece of equipment I haven't worked with before. The nervousness means you care about doing it right." Earl plugged the fan into his extension cord and looked at Zora expectantly. "Your project, Your Honors. Go ahead and flip the switch." Zora took a deep breath and pressed the power button. For a moment nothing happened, and her heart sank. Then, with a soft whir, the motor came to life and the blades began to turn, slowly at first, then with increasing speed until a cool breeze filled the garage. "It works," Zora exclaimed, her nervous energy transforming into pure joy. "Miss Darlene, it actually works." "Of course it works," Earl said with satisfaction. "You did good, thorough work. The motor just needed a moment to remember what it was supposed to do." Darlene stood up and moved closer to the fan, enjoying the cool air on her face. "This is wonderful, Zora. You took something that was broken and made it useful again. How does it feel?" "It feels like I helped something," Zora said, searching for words to describe the satisfaction she felt. "Like maybe Mrs. Chen threw it away too soon, and now it gets to be a fan again instead of just trash." "That's exactly right," Darlene said. "You gave it a second chance." The success of the fan project seemed to open something in Zora, a new confidence that manifested in increased curiosity about the world beyond mechanics. "Miss Darlene," she said, settling cross-legged on the floor near the humming fan, "you said you brought something broken from the hospital. Can I see it?" Darlene looked surprised. "You remembered that?" "I remember everything you tell me about your work," Zora replied matter-of-factly. "It's interesting how you fix people instead of machines." Darlene reached into her purse and pulled out a battered stethoscope, its rubber tubing cracked in several places, and the metal chest piece tarnished with age. "This old thing has been sitting in our supply closet for months. The tubing is split, so it doesn't work properly anymore. But I thought maybe I could look at it." Zora's eyes brightened with interest. "Even if I can't fix it, I could learn how it works." "That's exactly what I was thinking." Darlene handed over the stethoscope, watching as Zora immediately began examining it with the same methodical approach she'd used on the fan. Earl observed this exchange with quiet pleasure. "You know, Darlene, that's mighty thoughtful of you, to bring something from your world for her to explore." "It seemed natural," Darlene replied. "She's been so generous in sharing her mechanical knowledge with me. I wanted to return the favor." Zora was already tracing the path of the rubber tubing with her finger, following it from the earpieces to the chest piece. So the sound travels through these tubes, like how air travels through the pipes in an engine. Very much like that, Darlene confirmed. When I place the chest piece on someone's chest, it picks up the sounds of their heart beating and their lungs breathing. Those sounds travel up through the tubing to my ears. But if there are cracks in the tubes, the sound leaks out before it gets to your ears. Exactly right. You're a quick learner. Zora continued her examination, gently flexing the tubing to see the extent of the damage. The metal part looks okay, though, and the earpieces aren't broken. So really, all it needs is new tubing. In theory, yes, but stethoscope tubing isn't something you can just pick up at the hardware store. Earl cleared his throat. Actually, you might be surprised. I've got some flexible rubber tubing in my parts bin that might work. Medical-grade stuff. I used it years ago for a custom coolant system. Never know what might come in handy. As Earl rummaged through his carefully organized storage, Zora continued to study the stethoscope with growing fascination. Miss Darlene, what does a healthy heart sound like? As Earl rummaged through his carefully organized storage, Zora continued to study the stethoscope with growing fascination. Miss Darlene, what does a healthy heart sound like? Well, it has a steady rhythm, lub-dub like that. The lub is the sound of the heart valves closing as blood gets pumped out, and the dub is the sound of different valves closing as the heart refills with blood. Zora pressed the chest piece against her own shirt, then frowned when she couldn't hear anything. I can't hear my heart. That's because the tubing is cracked. Here. Darlene moved closer and positioned the chest piece properly on Zora's chest, then held the damaged tubing close to her own ear. I can barely hear it, but your heart sounds strong and healthy. Can I listen to yours? Darlene hesitated for just a moment. There was something intimate about sharing the sound of your heartbeat with someone else. But Zora's curiosity was so genuine, her interest so purely scientific, that refusal seemed impossible. Of course, she said, positioning the chest piece over her own heart and holding the cracked tubing so Zora could listen. Zora's face scrunched in concentration as she tried to hear through the damaged equipment. I think I can hear something, but it's really faint. Found it, Earl announced, returning with a coil of clear rubber tubing. This should be about the right diameter, and it's definitely flexible enough. For the next hour, the three of them worked together to repair the stethoscope. Earl helped with the precise cutting and fitting of the new tubing, while Darlene explained the importance of creating airtight seals at each connection point. Zora did most of the actual assembly work, her small fingers proving ideal for the delicate task of attaching the new tubing without damaging the metal components. Now comes the real test, Darlene said when they'd finished. Zora, would you like to be the first to try it out? With hands that trembled slightly with excitement, Zora placed the earpieces in her ears and positioned the chest piece over her own heart. Her eyes widened immediately. I can hear it. It really sounds like lub-dub, just like you said. She moved the chest piece around, listening to different areas. And I can hear my breathing, too. It sounds like wind in a tunnel. That's exactly right, Darlene said, her voice warm with shared excitement. You've just performed your first medical diagnostic test. Zora looked up with shining eyes. Can I listen to Grandpa's heart? And yours? I want to see if they sound different. Different people's hearts do have slightly different rhythms and sounds, Darlene explained, as Zora moved to examine Earl's chest. Age, fitness level, size, lots of things can affect what you hear. Earl submitted patiently to Zora's enthusiastic examination, chuckling when she announced that his heart sounded like a big, slow drum compared to her own. When Zora turned the stethoscope on Darlene, she listened with the same careful attention she brought to diagnosing mechanical problems. Your heart sounds a little faster than Grandpa's, she observed, but not as fast as mine. And there's another sound. Kind, Of like a whisper behind the lub-dub. Darlene and Earl exchanged a glance. The child's observation was remarkably accurate. Darlene did have a minor heart murmur that most people wouldn't detect without training. "You have very good ears," Darlene said. "That whisper you're hearing is what we call a murmur. It's not dangerous in my case, just a little quirk in how my heart valves work. So even when people aren't sick, their bodies can still sound different from each other." "That's right. Everyone is unique, just like every car engine has its own personality." As the afternoon wound down, Zora carefully cleaned the repaired stethoscope and handed it back to Darlene. "Thank you for letting me fix this, and for teaching me how to use it." "Thank you for bringing it back to life," Darlene replied. "I'll take it back to the hospital on Monday, and every time I use it, I'll think about this afternoon. Will you tell me stories about the people you help with it? I mean, not their names or private stuff, but just what it's like to use listening to help people feel better." Darlene considered the request. "I think I can do that. And maybe if you're interested, I could teach you more about how bodies work. The heart and lungs are just the beginning. There's a whole world of systems that keep people healthy. Like how a car has electrical systems and cooling systems and fuel systems. Exactly like that. The human body is the most complex machine you'll ever encounter." As Darlene prepared to leave, Zora asked the question that had been building throughout their afternoon together. "Miss Darlene, do you think my mama would be proud that I fixed something that helps people?" Darlene knelt down to Zora's eye level, choosing her words carefully. "Sweetheart, I think your mama would be amazed by what you've learned and how you're using that knowledge to help others. She always said the best part of being a nurse was knowing that your work made a real difference in people's lives. Maybe someday I could make a difference too." "I think you're already making a difference," Darlene said softly. "You've certainly made a difference in my life." As Darlene drove home that evening, she found herself thinking about the repaired stethoscope sitting in her passenger seat. It represented more than just a functional medical instrument. It was a bridge between two worlds, a tangible connection between her professional life and the growing friendship that had become the brightest part of her week. That night, as Earl tucked Zora into bed, she asked him about the whisper sound she'd heard in Miss Darlene's heart. "Is she okay, Grandpa? That murmur thing? Should I be worried about her?" Earl smoothed her hair back from her forehead. "Miss Darlene is fine, sweetheart. Sometimes bodies just work a little differently from each other, and that's normal. But you know what? The fact that you noticed and asked about it shows me you're developing a healer's heart to go with your mechanic's hands." "What's a healer's heart?" "It's when you care enough about people to pay attention to the details that might help them, when you listen not just with your ears, but with your heart." Zora drifted off to sleep that night thinking about the rhythmic sounds of heartbeats and the satisfaction of bringing broken things back to useful life. She was beginning to understand that the best kind of fixing wasn't just about making things work again. It was about making connections between people and finding ways to care for each other across the differences that might otherwise keep them apart. The following Wednesday brought unexpected rain to Maple Street, the kind of gentle, steady precipitation that sent most children indoors to fidget by windows and complain about boredom. But in Earl's garage, the rhythmic drumming on the metal roof created a cozy cocoon that made the space feel even more inviting than usual. Zora had been sorting through a box of old photographs when Darlene arrived, shaking raindrops from her umbrella and looking more tired than usual. Her shift at County General had been particularly challenging. A multi-car accident had brought in several trauma patients, and they'd lost an elderly man despite their best efforts. "Rough day?" Earl asked, noting the weariness in Darlene's posture as she settled onto her milk crate. "One of those days that reminds you why they call it practicing medicine," Darlene replied. "Sometimes you can do everything right and still not get the outcome you're hoping for." Zora looked up from Her photographs, her 7-year-old mind trying to process the sadness she heard in Miss Darlene's voice. Did someone not get better today? Darlene hesitated, then decided on honesty. No, sweetheart. Sometimes people are too badly hurt for us to fix them, no matter how hard we try. Like when a car gets totaled in a wreck? Zora asked, drawing on her mechanical understanding. Even if some parts still work, the whole thing is too damaged to save. That's actually a very good way to think about it, Darlene said, surprised by the child's insight. Sometimes the damage is just too extensive for repair. Zora returned to her photographs, but Earl could see her processing this new information. After a few minutes, she held up a small, faded picture. Miss Darlene, I found something I want to show you. The photograph was clearly old, its edges soft and colors slightly yellowed. It showed a young woman in nursing scrubs, her dark skin glowing with pride as she held up a diploma. The woman's smile was radiant, and even in the faded image, her resemblance to Zora was unmistakable. That's my mama on the day she graduated from nursing school, Zora said quietly. Grandpa says she was so excited she called everyone she knew. Darlene accepted the photograph with careful hands, studying the image of Zora Williams at the beginning of her career. She looked so happy, so ready to help people. She was, Earl added softly. Sarah had wanted to be a nurse since she was about Zora's age, used to practice on her dolls, giving them shots with toy syringes and wrapping their arms in bandages. Zora moved closer to Darlene's chair. Grandpa told me Mama said nursing was about more than just medical stuff. She said it was about seeing people when they were scared and helping them feel less alone. The words hung in the air between them, laden with meaning that went beyond their simple surface. Darlene felt tears prick her eyes as she recognized the deeper truth in what Zora Williams had understood about their profession. Your mama was very wise, Darlene said. That's exactly what nursing is about. The medical knowledge is important, but the human connection, that's what really heals people. Is that why you look so sad after hard days? Because you care about the people you couldn't help? The directness of the question took Darlene by surprise. She looked at this 7-year-old child who seemed to see straight through to emotions she thought she'd hidden and made a decision to be completely honest. Yes, she said. When someone dies, especially someone who might have lived if we'd been faster or smarter or luckier, it stays with you. You wonder if there was something else you could have tried. But you did your best, right? I always do my best. Then it's not your fault when the damage is too big to fix, Zora said with the simple logic of childhood. Grandpa says you can't blame the mechanic when a car's been in a bad enough wreck. Earl watched this exchange with growing amazement at his granddaughter's emotional intelligence. Zora's right, Darlene. You can't carry the weight of outcomes. You can't control. I know that intellectually, Darlene admitted, but knowing it and feeling it are two different things. Zora studied the photograph of her mother again, then looked up at Darlene with sudden intensity. Miss Darlene, do you live by yourself? The change of subject was so abrupt that both adults blinked. I do, Darlene replied. Why do you ask? Because when Grandpa gets sad about Mama, it helps when we talk about it. But if you go home to an empty house after losing someone at the hospital, who do you talk to? The question hit Darlene like a physical blow in its accuracy. How had this child identified the exact source of her loneliness with such precision? Darlene started, then stopped. I don't really have anyone to talk to about work. Most of my friends aren't in healthcare, so they don't understand. And talking about patient deaths isn't exactly dinner party conversation. That sounds really hard, Zora said, with the matter-of-fact sympathy that children sometimes display. No wonder you look tired all the time. Earl cleared his throat. Darlene, you know you're always welcome to call here if you need someone to talk to, day or night. That's very kind, Earl, but I couldn't impose. It wouldn't be imposing, Zora interrupted. It would be helping, like how you helped when my car was leaking gas, except with feelings instead of fuel lines. The analogy was so unexpected that Darlene found herself laughing despite her melancholy mood. You really do see everything in mechanical terms, don't you? It's how I understand things, Zora shrugged. But maybe that's okay. Maybe feelings work kind of like machines too. They need regular maintenance and someone to notice when something's wrong. Darlene looked at Earl, who was nodding thoughtfully. You know, that's not a bad way to think about emotional health. Regular check-ins, preventive care, addressing problems before they become critical. And you can't fix everything yourself, Zora added. Even Grandpa takes his truck to other mechanics sometimes when he needs help with something complicated. The rain continued its gentle percussion on the garage roof as the three of them sat in comfortable silence, processing the conversation. Finally, Darlene spoke. You know what's strange? I spend all day taking care of other people, but I'm terrible at taking care of myself. I work too many hours. I don't eat regularly. I don't have hobbies or close friends. She paused. I think I forgot how to be a person instead of just a nurse. Maybe that's something we could help you remember, Zora suggested. I mean, you've been teaching me about helping people. Maybe we could teach you about taking breaks and having fun. What did you have in mind? Zora looked around the garage, her mind clearly working. Well, you could come here when you're not working, not to teach me stuff or learn about fixing things, but just to be here, like friends do. Friends, Darlene repeated softly. I haven't had real friends in a long time. That's because you've been too busy being useful to everyone else, Earl observed. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is let yourself be cared for, instead of always being the one doing the caring. As the afternoon progressed, they found themselves talking about things that had nothing to do with medicine or mechanics, childhood memories, favorite foods, books they'd loved, places they'd like to visit someday. Darlene discovered that Earl had once wanted to be a pilot, and she shared her secret dream of learning to paint watercolors. Why don't you paint? Zora asked. You have free time sometimes, right? I tell myself I'm too tired after work, or that I don't have the right supplies, or that I wouldn't be any good at it, Darlene admitted. Those sound like excuses, Zora said with characteristic bluntness. Grandpa says excuses are just fear, wearing a disguise, Earl chuckled. I think I said that about why people don't learn to change their own oil, but it applies to lots of things. Maybe you're right, Darlene said. Maybe I've been making excuses. By the time the rain stopped, and Darlene prepared to leave, something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. What had begun as casual friendship was deepening into something more significant, a chosen family of sorts, bound together by mutual care and understanding. Miss Darlene, Zora said as they walked toward her car, would you like to have dinner with us sometime? Grandpa makes really good spaghetti, and we could talk more about non-work stuff. Darlene felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. I would love that very much. And maybe we could go buy some paints together? I don't know anything about watercolors, but I bet learning about them would be interesting. You would do that with me? Friends help each other try new things, Zora said simply. That's what Mama used to tell me. As Darlene drove home through the rain-washed streets, she found herself thinking about the photograph of Zora Williams on her graduation day. That young woman's daughter was growing up to be someone special, someone who could see past the surface of things to the human need underneath. For the first time in months, Darlene felt something she'd almost forgotten how to feel. The warm anticipation of having people in her life who cared about her well-being, not just her usefulness. It was a small shift, but as she'd learned in 30 years of nursing, sometimes the smallest changes could make the biggest difference in how someone felt about their life. That night, she found herself looking up art supply stores online, and, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she went to bed thinking about possibilities instead of problems. The Saturday that followed brought perfect September weather to Maple Street, crisp enough to hint at the coming autumn, but still warm enough for comfortable garage work. Darlene arrived earlier than usual, carrying a small gift bag that she handed to Zora with barely contained excitement. "What's this for?" Zora asked, accepting the bag with curiosity. "Open it and see." Inside was a small toolbox, painted bright red and clearly designed for someone with smaller hands. It contained a basic set of screwdrivers, pliers, a small hammer, and various other tools, perfectly sized for a 7-year-old's grip. Zora's eyes went wide. "These are for me. Really for me. Really for you," Darlene confirmed. "I figured it. Was time you had your own tools, instead of always borrowing your grandfather's." Earl examined the toolbox with approval. "That's mighty thoughtful, Darlene. Look at the quality on these. They're real tools, not toys." The man at the hardware store said they're professional grade, just scaled down, Darlene explained. "He seemed impressed when I told him what you've been working on, Zora." Zora was already testing the weight and feel of each tool, her face glowing with pure happiness. "Thank you, Miss Darlene. This is the best present I've ever gotten." "Better than your Christmas bike?" Earl teased. "Different kind of best," Zora replied seriously. "The bike is for fun, but these are for helping." As Zora arranged her new tools in the small compartments of the toolbox, Darlene shared what she'd been thinking about since their conversation earlier in the week. "You know, Zora, our talk about feelings and maintenance made me realize something. In nursing, we learn about body systems, how the heart works with the lungs, how the digestive system connects to overall health. But maybe we should think about emotional systems the same way." Earl settled into his chair, recognizing the beginning of what promised to be an interesting discussion. "How so?" "Well, take loneliness, for example. I always thought of it as just a feeling, something to ignore or push through. But what if it's more like a symptom? What if it's my emotional system telling me that something needs attention?" Zora looked up from organizing her tools. "Like when an engine makes a weird noise because it needs oil?" "Exactly like that. The noise isn't the problem. It's the warning that there's a problem." "So being lonely is your feelings' way of saying you need more friends?" Zora asked. "I think it might be," Darlene agreed. "And being tired all the time might be my body's way of saying I need to rest more, not just work harder." Earl nodded approvingly. "That's good thinking. Most problems get worse when you ignore the warning signs." Darlene pulled out a small notebook from her purse. "I've been writing down some of the things you've both taught me about maintenance and repair. I thought maybe I could apply those principles to taking better care of myself." "What kind of things?" Zora asked, genuinely interested. "Well, regular maintenance prevents major breakdowns. That might mean scheduling time for rest and relaxation, not just when I'm already exhausted. And keeping good relationships requires attention and effort, just like keeping a car running smoothly. And you can't fix everything yourself," Earl added. "Sometimes you need help from people who have different skills or fresh perspective." "Right. I've been trying to handle everything alone for so long that I forgot how much easier things can be when you have support." Zora had finished organizing her toolbox and was now examining a small transistor radio that Earl had brought her from his collection of repair projects. "Miss Darlene, can I ask you something kind of personal?" "Of course, sweetheart. Why don't you have a family? I mean, besides work family?" Darlene was quiet for a moment, considering how to answer such a direct question honestly but appropriately. "I was married once, a long time ago, but my husband wanted me to stop working when we had children, and I couldn't give up nursing. We wanted different things, so we got divorced." "Did you want children?" "I did, But by the time I felt ready to try again, I was older, and it didn't happen for me. Darlene's voice carried a sadness that even Zora could hear. I threw myself into work instead, told myself that taking care of other people's children was enough. But it wasn't enough? No, sweetheart, it wasn't enough. Zora set down the radio and moved closer to Darlene's chair. Is that why you like spending time with me? Because I'm kind of like having a kid, but not really. The question was so perceptive and so gently asked that Darlene felt tears spring to her eyes. Oh, Zora, yes, in a way, but it's more than that. You're not a substitute for something I'm missing. You're a person I genuinely enjoy being with. You're smart and kind, and you see the world in ways that make me think differently. Good different. Very good different. Earl watched this exchange with deep satisfaction. He'd seen the changes in both Zora and Darlene over the past month. His granddaughter becoming more confident and outgoing, and Darlene slowly learning to let herself be cared for instead of always being the caregiver. You know what I think? Earl said. I think families don't always look the way people expect them to. Sometimes they're made up of people who choose each other instead of being born to each other. Like us? Zora asked hopefully. Exactly like us, Darlene confirmed, reaching over to smooth Zora's hair. If you'll have me as part of your family, I'd be honored to be here. Of course we'll have you, Zora said, as if the question was silly. You're already part of our family. You just needed to make it official. As if to celebrate this moment of recognition, Zora opened her new toolbox and pulled out a small screwdriver. Want to help me take apart this radio? I want to see how the sound gets from the waves in the air to the speaker. For the next 2 hours, the three of them worked together on the radio project, with Darlene asking questions about electronics while Earl explained concepts and Zora did most of the hands-on work. There was something deeply satisfying about the collaboration. 3 generations working together, each contributing their unique perspective and skills. You know what's interesting? Darlene observed as they identified the various components. Inside the radio, this is exactly what we do at the hospital when we're working on a complicated case. Everyone brings their expertise, and together we can figure out things that none of us could solve alone. Except this is more fun, Zora said, carefully removing a small circuit board. And if we mess up, nobody gets hurt. That's true. Though I have to say, working on something where the only pressure is curiosity and learning, it's pretty relaxing. Earl noticed how different Darlene looked when she was relaxed. The tension lines around her eyes had softened, and she moved with less of the careful urgency that seemed to characterize her hospital demeanor. Darlene, he said, when was the last time you spent a whole Saturday doing something just for fun? She thought about it seriously. I honestly can't remember, probably years. That's not healthy, Zora said with 7-year-old authority. Grandpa says people need playtime, just like engines need rest time between jobs. Your grandfather's right. I've forgotten how to play. That's okay, Zora assured her. We can teach you. It's like riding a bike. Once you remember how, it comes back pretty easy. As the afternoon progressed into evening, Darlene found herself reluctant to leave. The garage had become a sanctuary where she could be herself instead of Nurse Washington, where her value wasn't measured by her usefulness, but by her simple presence. Would you two like to come to my apartment for dinner next week? She asked as they began putting away tools. I can't promise anything as elaborate as Earl's spaghetti, but I make a decent chicken and rice. Can I see where you live? Zora asked with interest. Of course. Though I should warn you, it's pretty quiet compared to here. I don't have a garage full of interesting projects. Maybe we could start one, Zora suggested. I bet there are things in your apartment that could use fixing or improving, Earl chuckled. Better be careful, Darlene. Once Zora gets going on improvement projects, there's no stopping her. I think I'd like that, Darlene said. having someone care enough to improve my space. As she drove home that evening, Darlene reflected on the small red toolbox that had started the day's conversation. She'd chosen it carefully, wanting to give Zora something that acknowledged both her skills and her growing independence. But in the process, she'd ended up receiving something far more valuable, a sense of belonging that she hadn't realized she'd been missing. That night, for the first time in months, she looked around her tidy, quiet apartment, and instead of seeing a refuge from the world's demands, she saw possibilities for making it a place where friends would want to visit, where laughter might echo off the walls, where the silence might be broken by the sound of small hands working on projects and young voices asking the kinds of questions that made you think about the world differently. She was beginning to understand that the repair work she needed most wasn't mechanical or even medical. It was the careful, patient restoration of her ability to be part of something larger than herself, to give and receive care in equal measure, to remember that healing sometimes happened as much through human connection as through professional skill. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early October, delivered with the usual stack of bills and advertisements that Earl retrieved from the mailbox during his morning walk. It was addressed to Darlene Washington, care of Earl Williams, which struck him as odd, since Darlene had never used his address for mail before. When she arrived that afternoon for what had become their regular Tuesday visit, Earl handed her the official-looking envelope with some concern. "This came for you today. Hope it's not bad news." Darlene examined the return address, County Hospital Administration, and felt her stomach tighten. Official mail from the hospital rarely contained good news, especially when it was sent to someone's personal address rather than through internal channels. Zora looked up from her current project, a vintage clock radio that had belonged to her mother. "What's wrong, Miss Darlene? You look worried." "Probably nothing, sweetheart. Just work stuff." Darlene opened the envelope carefully, her eyes scanning the formal letterhead and dense paragraphs of administrative language. As she read, her expression grew increasingly troubled. Earl noticed the change immediately. "Darlene, what is it?" She finished reading, then looked up with a mixture of shock and dismay. "They're transferring me to Regional Medical Center. It's a promotion, actually. Head of nursing for their new cardiac unit." "But that's good news, isn't it?" Zora asked, though something in Darlene's tone suggested otherwise. "It's a wonderful opportunity," Darlene said carefully. "Regional is the biggest hospital in the state. It would be a significant step up in my career." Earl heard what she wasn't saying. But Regional is 3 hours away, in the capital. I'd have to move, probably within the next 6 weeks, to start the position after the holidays." The garage fell silent, except for the distant sound of Mrs. Patterson's television and the gentle hum of Zora's repaired fan in the corner. The weight of what this meant settled over all three of them like a heavy blanket. "You'd have to leave." Zora's voice was very small. Yes, sweetheart. If I take the position, I'd have to leave." Zora set down her small screwdriver with careful precision, her movements suddenly deliberate in the way that meant she was fighting back strong emotions. "When would you go?" "The letter says I need to give them an answer by Friday. And if I accept, I'd start the first Monday in December. That's only 7 weeks, Earl calculated quietly. "I know." Darlene's voice was barely above a whisper. Zora stood up from her workspace and walked to the garage opening, looking out at the street where Darlene's repaired Honda sat in its familiar spot. For a long moment, she didn't speak, and the adults watched her small figure silhouetted against the afternoon light. "Zora?" Earl called gently. "What are you thinking, little one?" She turned back to face them, and both Earl and Darlene were surprised to see that while her eyes were bright with unshed tears, her expression was thoughtful rather than devastated. "I'm thinking about when Mama died," she said slowly. "How one Day she was here and then she wasn't, and I didn't get to say goodbye or ask her all the questions I wanted to ask. Darlene felt her heart break a little. Oh, Zora. But this is different, Zora continued, her voice gaining strength, because we know about it ahead of time, and because you're not dying, you're just moving, and because... She paused, working through her thoughts with the careful logic that made her so good at diagnosing mechanical problems. Because this time, I get to help decide what happens next. Earl leaned forward in his chair. What do you mean by that? I mean, Miss Darlene has a choice to make, and maybe we can help her think it through. Like when she helps her patients figure out the best treatment. She gives them information and options, but they get to decide what's right for them. Darlene looked at this 7-year-old who continued to amaze her with her emotional intelligence. What kind of information do you think I need? Zora walked back to her workspace and picked up the transfer notice, studying it with the same careful attention she gave to repair manuals. Well, first, what exactly would this job be like? Would you be happier doing it than what you do now? It would be more responsibility, better pay, working with cutting-edge cardiac technology, Darlene explained. It's the kind of position I dreamed about when I was starting my career, but would you like the work better? Darlene considered the question seriously. I think I would enjoy the challenge and the opportunity to help develop new programs, but I'd be doing more administration and less direct patient care, so you'd be further away from the fixing people part. Zora asked. In some ways, yes. Earl had been listening quietly, but now he spoke up. Darlene, can I ask you something? If this opportunity had come up 6 months ago before you started spending time with us, what would your answer have been? I would have said yes immediately, Darlene admitted, without even thinking about it. Career advancement was the only thing I was focused on. And now? Darlene looked around the garage, at Earl's comfortable chaos of tools and projects, at Zora's small hands still holding the official letter, at the fan humming quietly in the corner. Now I have other things to consider. Zora carefully folded the letter and handed it back to Darlene. What other things? You two, for one. This friendship we've built. It's become really important to me. More important than I realized until I thought about losing it. But friendships don't have to end just because people live in different places, Zora pointed out. People visit each other. They talk on the phone. They write letters. That's true, Earl agreed. Though it's not the same as being able to see each other regularly. No, it's not the same, Darlene acknowledged. And there's something else, too. I've been thinking about what we talked about taking care of myself and having balance in my life. Regional Medical Center is known for being extremely demanding. If I take this job, I'd probably go back to working 16-hour days and being too tired for anything else. Zora frowned. That doesn't sound very healthy. It's not. But it would be good for my career. Are those the only two choices? Earl asked. Taking this job or staying exactly where you are? What do you mean? Well, you've been at County General for, 5 years. Have you ever asked about opportunities there? Different positions, new responsibilities? Darlene looked surprised. I know, actually. I've just assumed that to advance I'd have to leave. Maybe that's not true, Zora suggested. Maybe there are options you haven't thought about because you were too busy working to look for them. The three of them sat in contemplative silence for a few minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Darlene spoke. You know what's strange? For the first time in my career, I'm not sure what I want. I used to think I wanted to climb as high as possible in hospital administration, but these past few months have reminded me why I became a nurse in the first place. To help people, to make connections, to be part of a community. Those are good things to want, Earl said, but they're not the same things that get you promoted to head of nursing at a major medical center. Zora had returned to her clock radio project, but Earl could tell she was still listening carefully. "Miss Darlene," she said without looking up from her work, "can I tell you something Grandpa taught me about fixing things?" "Of course." He said that sometimes when something isn't working right, the problem isn't that it's broken. Sometimes the problem is that it's in the wrong place or being used for the wrong job. Darlene smiled despite her worry. "Are you saying I might be like a good part that's just in the wrong machine?" "Maybe. Or maybe you're in the right machine, but you need to find a different job within it," Earl chuckled. "Out of the mouths of babes. Zora's right, you know. Sometimes the solution isn't changing everything. It's changing your position within, what you already have." "I hadn't thought about it that way," Darlene admitted. "I've been so focused on external opportunities that I haven't considered what might be possible where I am. Plus," Zora added, "if you stayed at County General, you could keep living here, and we could keep being a family." The simple statement hung in the air, carrying more weight than its few words suggested. This child, who had already lost her mother, was now facing the possibility of losing another important person in her life. But rather than begging or crying, she was trying to help Darlene think through the decision rationally. "Zora," Darlene said softly, "what would you do if I decided to take the job and move away?" "I'd be sad," Zora replied honestly, "really sad, but I'd also be proud of you for doing something that was good for your career, and I'd make sure we stayed friends no matter what. Even if I could only visit sometimes, even then, because good friendships are worth taking care of, even when it's hard." Earl felt his eyes mist over at his granddaughter's maturity. 7 years old, and she was already understanding things about love and loss and loyalty that some adults never learned. "You know what?" Darlene said, folding the letter and putting it back in its envelope. "I think I need to do some research before I make this decision. Maybe talk to some people at County General about other possibilities. Maybe think about what I really want my life to look like, not just my career." "That sounds smart," Zora agreed. "Grandpa always says you should understand all your options before you pick the best one." "How long do you have to decide?" Earl asked. "Until Friday. That gives me 3 days to gather information and really think it through. And if you need help thinking or want to talk about your options, we're here," Zora offered. "Sometimes it's easier to figure things out when you have people to help you think." As Darlene prepared to leave that afternoon, she felt a strange mixture of anxiety and clarity. The transfer offer represented everything she thought she'd wanted professionally, but the conversation with Earl and Zora had helped her realize that her priorities had shifted in ways she hadn't fully recognized. "Thank you both," she said as she reached her car, "for helping me think this through instead of just reacting." "That's what families do," Zora replied. "They help each other make good decisions." Driving home, Darlene found herself thinking about the word family and how its meaning had expanded for her over the past few months. She'd started visiting Maple Street as a way to honor her friendship with Zora Williams, but somewhere along the way, Earl and Zora had become family in a way she'd never expected. The question now was whether that newfound sense of belonging was worth more than a prestigious career opportunity 3 hours away. It was a choice she'd never thought she'd have to make, but as she'd learned from watching Zora approach mechanical problems, sometimes the most important decisions required looking at familiar situations from entirely new angles. The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity as word of Darlene's potential transfer spread through the neighborhood with the speed that only small communities can achieve. By Thursday morning, it seemed like half of Maple Street knew about the situation, and by Thursday afternoon, Earl's garage had become an unofficial command center for what could only be described as a grassroots campaign. It started with Mrs. Chen from down the street, who arrived Wednesday evening with a casserole and a pointed question about whether that nice nurse woman was really thinking about leaving. When Earl confirmed the situation, Mrs. Chen had pursed her lips in the way that meant she was about to take action. "That won't do at all," she declared. "Miss Darlene belongs here, anyone can see that." By Thursday morning, Mrs. Chen had enlisted Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Rodriguez from the corner house, and the young couple with twins who lived across from Earl. They'd been joined by several people from the hospital, nurses who worked with Darlene, a few doctors who'd noticed the positive changes in her demeanor over the past few months, and even Mike from the service station who remembered the fuel line incident. Zora watched this mobilization with fascination and growing hope. She'd never seen adults organize themselves around helping someone make a personal decision, and the level of caring being demonstrated amazed her. "Why are all these people working so hard to help Miss Darlene?" she asked Earl as they watched. Mrs. Patterson and Mrs. Chen debate the best approach for contacting the hospital administration. "Because your Miss Darlene has touched more lives than she realizes," Earl replied. "Sometimes when you're focused on just doing your job and helping people one at a time, you don't see the bigger picture of how much you matter to a whole community." "That what happened to Mama too?" Earl considered the question. "I think so. Your mama was so humble about her work that she never understood how many people she helped, how many families remember her kindness during difficult times." The conversation was interrupted by Mr. Rodriguez, approaching with a clipboard and a determined expression. "Earl, we're putting together a petition to present to County General's Board of Directors. We want to show them that keeping Darlene here benefits the whole community, not just the hospital." "What kind of petition?" Zora asked, her mechanical mind immediately interested in the logistics. "We're asking everyone who's been helped by Miss Darlene to write a short statement about why she's important to our neighborhood and to the hospital. Then we'll present it to the administration as evidence that she's a valuable community asset." Earl nodded approvingly. "That's smart thinking. Sometimes numbers and personal stories carry more weight than individual requests." "The thing is," Mr. Rodriguez continued, "we need someone to coordinate the effort, to make sure we reach everyone who might want to participate. Someone who knows the community well and who has time to organize things properly." Both men looked at Zora, who was following the conversation with intense concentration. "You want me to help?" she asked. "If you're willing," Mr. Rodriguez replied. "You know this neighborhood better than most adults, and people trust you. Plus, you understand why this is important better than anyone." Zora looked at Earl, who gave her an encouraging nod. "What would I need to do?" "Help us make a list of everyone who should be contacted. Maybe help deliver the petition forms to houses where people might want to participate, and collect the completed forms when people are ready. Kind of like being a project coordinator?" "Exactly. Like that." For the next several hours, Zora threw herself into the organizational effort with the same methodical approach she brought to mechanical projects. She drew a detailed map of the neighborhood, marked each house where she thought residents might want to participate, and created a schedule for efficient collection routes. Earl watched his granddaughter work with amazement and pride. She was demonstrating leadership skills and community awareness that impressed even the adults involved in the effort. Meanwhile, Darlene was conducting her own research at County General. She'd spent Wednesday evening and all of Thursday asking questions she'd never thought to ask before, about advancement opportunities within the hospital, about new programs being planned, about whether her skills and interests might align with positions she hadn't previously considered. What she discovered surprised her. County General was in the early stages of developing a new community outreach program designed to provide better healthcare access to underserved neighborhoods. They needed someone to develop and lead the program, someone with clinical experience, community connections, and the ability to build relationships across diverse populations. It was exactly the kind of work that appealed to her, combining direct patient care with program development and community engagement. But the position hadn't been posted yet because they were still securing funding. The thing is, Dr. Martinez, the chief of staff, explained during their Thursday afternoon conversation, we've been looking for the right person to lead this initiative. But everyone we've considered has been too focused on traditional career advancement to be interested in community-based work. What if someone was interested? Darlene asked carefully. Then we'd want to talk to them immediately. This program could be transformative for both the hospital and the community we serve. Thursday evening found Darlene back at Earl's garage, where she discovered the neighborhood campaign in full swing. The garage had been transformed into an organizational hub, with clipboards, petition forms, and maps spread across Earl's workbench. "What's all this?" she asked, looking around in amazement. Zora looked up from her coordination charts with a slightly guilty expression. "We might have started a campaign to convince the hospital to keep you here." "You did what?" "The whole neighborhood wants to help," Earl explained. "When word got out about your transfer opportunity, people started organizing themselves. Zora's been coordinating the effort." Darlene examined the petition forms, reading the heartfelt statements that neighbors and colleagues had already submitted. There were stories about her kindness during medical emergencies, her patience with elderly patients, her willingness to go beyond her official duties to help families in crisis. "I had no idea," she said softly. "I never realized that so many people noticed or cared." "That's because you've been too busy helping to pay attention to how much you're appreciated," Mrs. Chen said, appearing at the garage entrance with another completed petition form. "Sometimes it takes a crisis to make people speak up about what they value." Zora approached Darlene with her clipboard of organizational notes. "Miss Darlene, I need to ask you something important. Are we doing the right thing? I mean, do you want us to try to convince you to stay, or are we making this harder for you?" The directness of the question stopped all conversation in the garage. Everyone turned to look at Darlene, waiting for her answer. "Oh, sweetheart," Darlene said, kneeling down to Zora's level. "You're asking exactly the right question. The truth is, seeing how much you all care about me staying, it's affecting my decision, but in a good way." "How so?" "It's helping me understand something I didn't see before. I've spent so much time thinking about advancing my career that I forgot to think about what kind of life I want to have. And what I want is to be part of a community that cares about each other, to do work that makes a real difference in people's lives, and to have friendships that matter." Earl smiled. "Sounds like you're figuring out what's really important." "I am. And I should tell you all something. I talked to Dr. Martinez today about opportunities at County General. There might be a position coming available that would be perfect for me, something that combines nursing with community outreach and program development. Here," Zora asked hopefully, "you could stay here. If the funding comes through and they offer me the position, yes, I could stay here." The garage erupted in pleased murmurs and quiet celebration, but Zora held up her hand for attention. "That's wonderful," she said seriously, "but we should still finish the petition. Even if you get offered a different job here, the hospital should know how much the community values you. That might help with the funding for the new program." Once again, Earl marveled at his granddaughter's strategic thinking. At 7 years old, she was already understanding the political and practical aspects of organizational decision-making. "You're absolutely right," Mr. Rodriguez agreed. "A strong show of community support could be exactly what they need to justify expanding their programs." As the evening progressed, the garage filled with neighbors, hospital colleagues, and friends, all working together to complete the petition effort. Darlene found herself at the center of a community she hadn't realized she belonged to, surrounded by people who valued her not just for her professional skills, but for her presence in their lives. "You know what this reminds me of," she said to Earl as they watched Zora efficiently organize the completed petition forms. "It reminds me of the best parts of nursing, when everyone works together toward a common goal, when individual efforts combine to create something bigger than any one person could accomplish alone. Except this time, you're the patient," Earl observed with a smile. "In a way, I suppose I am. I needed healing, just not the kind I was trained to provide." As the night wound down and neighbors began to head home, Zora approached Darlene with the completed petition. Nearly 50 statements from community members, hospital staff, and local business owners, all expressing appreciation for Darlene's contributions and support for keeping her at County General. "Tomorrow's Friday," Zora said, handing over the thick folder of documents. "You have to give the hospital your answer about the transfer." "I do. Are you ready?" Darlene looked around the garage, at the evidence of community support spread across Earl's workbench, at the faces of people who had become family, at the 7-year-old who had somehow become one of her most trusted advisors. "Yes," she said with certainty. "I'm ready." That night, as Darlene drove home with the petition folder on her passenger seat, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that afternoon when Zora had noticed a gas leak under her car. What had started as a simple act of mechanical observation had led to a transformation she could never have anticipated. Tomorrow would bring the conversation with Regional Medical Centers Administration and the formal decision about her future. But tonight, for the first time in years, she knew exactly what she wanted and why she wanted it. She wanted to build a life that included both meaningful work and meaningful relationships, both professional growth and personal happiness. And she wanted to do it here, in this community, with this chosen family that had taught her the difference between being useful and being valued, between having a career and having a life. Friday morning arrived grey and drizzly, the kind of weather that matched the nervous energy Zora had been carrying since waking up before dawn. She'd spent the early hours in the garage organizing and reorganizing her tools while trying not to think about the possibility that Miss Darlene might decide to take the transfer after all. Earl found her there when he came out for his morning coffee, sitting cross-legged on the floor with her small toolbox open beside her, methodically cleaning each implement with more attention than was strictly necessary. "Worried about today?" he asked gently, settling into his folding chair despite the early hour. "I keep thinking about what she said about this being a big opportunity for her career," Zora replied, without looking up from polishing a tiny wrench. "What if the community petition isn't enough? What if she decides the transfer is too good to pass up?" "Then we'll be sad, but we'll support her decision," Earl said. "That's what people who love each other do. They want what's best for each other, even when it's hard." Zora set down the wrench and looked at her grandfather with eyes that held more understanding than most 7-year-olds possessed. "I know that's the right thing to think, but I still hope she chooses to stay." "Me too, little one. Me too." Their quiet conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car door slamming in the driveway, unusual for 8 o'clock on a Friday morning. Through the garage opening, they could see Darlene approaching with purposeful strides, dressed in her professional scrubs, but carrying a manila folder that could only be the completed petition. "You're early," Earl observed as she reached the garage. "I have a meeting with Dr. Martinez and the board at 9, Darlene explained, her voice tight with nervous energy. "I wanted to stop by first, to thank you both for everything you've done, and to tell us your decision." Zora interrupted, standing up from her spot on the floor. Darlene looked down at this child who had become so important to her, who had helped her understand things about herself that she'd never recognized before. "Yes, sweetheart. I wanted you to be the first to know." The garage fell silent except for the soft patter of rain on the metal roof. Earl and Zora waited, both trying to read Darlene's expression for clues about what she'd decided. "I'm turning down the transfer to Regional Medical Center," Darlene said quietly. "I'm staying here." Zora's face lit up with pure joy, but before she could speak, Darlene held up her hand. "But I need you both to understand something. I'm not staying just because I don't want to leave you, though that's certainly part of it. I'm staying because this is where I can do the work I really want to do, where I can build the kind of life I actually want to live." "The community outreach position?" Earl asked. "If they offer it to me, yes. Dr. Martinez seemed very interested when I talked to him about it yesterday. But even if that doesn't work out, I've realized that advancement for its own sake isn't what makes me happy. Connection does. Purpose does. Being part of something bigger than myself does." Zora practically bounced with excitement. "So you're staying because you want to, not just because we asked you to?" "I'm staying because you two taught me the difference between having a job and having a life. Because this community has shown me what it feels like to be valued for who I am, not just what I can do. And because," Darlene's voice grew soft, "because I finally understand what your mama meant about nursing being more than medical knowledge. It's about seeing people and helping them feel less alone." Earl stood up and pulled Darlene into a warm hug. "Sarah would be proud of both of you," he said quietly. "Proud of Zora for caring enough to organize the whole neighborhood, and proud of you for choosing happiness over prestige." "I have something for you," Zora said suddenly, reaching into her toolbox and pulling out a small, carefully wrapped package. "I was going to give it to you no matter what you decided, but now it can be a staying present instead of a goodbye present." Darlene accepted the package with curious hands, unwrapping it to reveal a small, handwritten letter on notebook paper, accompanied by a tiny mechanical drawing of a stethoscope. "Read it out loud," Zora requested, settling back onto the floor. Darlene cleared her throat and began to read. "Dear hospital people, my name is Zora Williams, and I am 7 years old. I want to tell you about Miss Darlene Washington, who works at your hospital. She's the best nurse in the whole world, and also the best friend. Miss Darlene saved my grandpa and me when she noticed things were sad after my mama died. She comes to our garage and listens to us talk about fixing things, and she tells us about helping sick people get better. She taught me how to use a stethoscope, and I taught her how to fix a fan. We help each other with problems, but the most important thing about Miss Darlene is that she pays attention. When I saw her car leaking gas, I told her because Grandpa taught me that when you see someone in danger, you speak up. But Miss Darlene does that every day at the hospital. She pays attention to what people need and she helps them even when it's hard. I know you want to promote her to a fancy job far away, but our neighborhood needs her here. When people are scared or hurt, they need someone who really sees them and cares about them. Miss Darlene is that person for lots of people in our town. If she stays here, I promise to keep learning about helping people, so maybe someday I can be a good helper too. Miss Darlene is teaching me that fixing people and fixing machines both start with paying attention and caring enough to help. Please let her stay so she can keep being our Miss Darlene, and so our town can keep being the kind of place where people take care of each other. Thank you for reading my letter. Your friend, Zora Williams, P.S. I drew a picture of the stethoscope we fixed together because working together to fix things is one of the best parts of being friends. By the time Darlene finished reading, both she and Earl had tears in their eyes. The letter captured something essential about community, friendship, and the true purpose of healing work. "Zora," Darlene said softly, "this is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever written about me. How did you know exactly what to say?" "I just wrote what was true," Zora replied with characteristic directness. "Sometimes the truth is the best thing to say, even if it makes you nervous." Earl shook his head in amazement. 7 years old, and already wiser than most adults I know. "Are you really going to give this to the hospital board?" Darlene asked. "Only if you want me to," Zora said. I mean, you're already staying, so maybe you don't need it anymore? Oh, I'm definitely taking this with me to the meeting. This letter says things about the value of community healthcare that I could never articulate as well. It might help them understand why the outreach program is so important. As Darlene prepared to leave for her meeting, Zora had one more question. Miss Darlene, when you talk to the hospital people, will you tell them about me wanting to be a helper someday? I mean, I know I'm too little now, but maybe someday I could volunteer or something. I will absolutely tell them about you, Darlene promised, and I suspect that by the time you're old enough to volunteer, you'll have taught me more about healing than I ever could have imagined. Earl watched this exchange with deep satisfaction. His granddaughter was learning lessons about courage, community, and caring that would serve her well throughout her life. And Darlene was discovering that sometimes the most important career decisions weren't about climbing higher, but about digging deeper roots in places where you could grow and flourish. As Darlene drove toward the hospital with Zora's letter on the seat beside her, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that summer afternoon when a 7-year-old had noticed a gas leak and cared enough to speak up. That moment of attention and courage had led to discoveries about friendship, family, and purpose that she'd never expected. In a few minutes, she would walk into a boardroom and make her case for staying at County General, for developing new programs that could serve the community better, for choosing relationships and meaning over prestigious advancement. And she would do it with the confidence that came from finally understanding what she really wanted from her life. The conference room at County General felt more formal than usual when Darlene arrived at 9 o'clock sharp, carrying the community petition, Zora's letter, and a folder of notes she'd prepared about the outreach program opportunity. Dr. Martinez was there, along with 3 board members she recognized, and one she didn't. Darlene, thank you for coming in, Dr. Martinez said, gesturing toward a chair across from the panel. We understand you have some thoughts about the regional medical center opportunity. I do, Darlene replied, settling into her seat with more confidence than she'd expected to feel. I'm honored that Regional considered me for the position, but I've decided to decline the transfer. The board members exchanged glances, and Dr. Martinez leaned forward slightly. May I ask what factors influenced your decision? Darlene opened her folder and pulled out Zora's letter first. I'd like to start by sharing something that helped me understand why this decision was important. A 7-year-old in my neighborhood wrote this letter to the hospital administration. She read Zora's words aloud, watching the faces of the board members as they listened to a child's perspective on community healthcare and the value of personal connection in healing. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. That's quite remarkable, said Mrs. Henderson, the longest-serving board member. How does a 7-year-old know so much about what makes effective healthcare? Because she pays attention, Darlene replied, and because she's been affected by both exceptional healthcare and the loss of someone important to her. Her mother was a nurse here, Zora Williams. She died in a car accident 3 months ago. Dr. Martinez nodded. I remember Sarah. Excellent. Nurse, wonderful with pediatric patients. Zora has been living with her grandfather since then, and I've been visiting them regularly. Through that relationship, I've learned things about healing and community connection that I never understood. During my years of professional training, Darlene pulled out the petition folder next. I've also brought statements from community members about the importance of maintaining strong healthcare connections in our neighborhoods. Nearly 50 people took time to write about their experiences with County General, and specifically about the value of having healthcare providers who are part of the community fabric. She distributed copies of the petition to each board member, giving them time to scan through the personal stories and testimonials. "This is impressive community engagement," acknowledged Mr. Patterson, the board's newest member. "But I'm curious about your professional reasons for declining such a significant opportunity." "That's where I'd like to discuss the community outreach program Dr. Martinez mentioned," Darlene said, grateful for the opening. "The position at regional would have been a step up in traditional terms. More prestige, higher salary, bigger hospital. But it would also have meant moving away from direct patient care and community engagement, which I've realized are the aspects of nursing that matter most to me." Dr. Martinez leaned back in his chair. "Tell us more about your interest in the outreach program. From my conversations with community members over the past few months, I've identified several gaps in our current healthcare delivery. We have excellent emergency and acute care, but we're missing opportunities for preventive care, health education, and early intervention in underserved neighborhoods." Darlene outlined her vision for mobile health clinics, community education, programs and partnerships with local organizations to improve health outcomes. She referenced specific examples from her neighborhood observations and conversations with families who struggled to access consistent health care. "The most interesting aspect," she continued, "is that some of our best potential solutions come from community members themselves. I've learned about home remedies that actually work, family caregiving strategies that we could incorporate into our discharge planning, and community leaders who could help us reach populations we've struggled to serve." Mrs. Henderson looked intrigued. "You're talking about bi-directional learning, the hospital learning from the community as much as teaching it." "Exactly. And that requires healthcare providers who are embedded in the community, who understand local culture and build long-term relationships." Mr. Patterson consulted his notes. "The funding for this program isn't guaranteed yet. Would you be willing to help develop the proposal and seek funding, even if it means staying in your current position for an uncertain period?" "I would," Darlene replied without hesitation. "I believe in this work, and I'm committed to making it happen." Dr. Martinez smiled. "That's exactly the kind of dedication we need for this initiative. Darlene, I'd like to offer you the position of Community Health Coordinator, effective immediately. Your first responsibility will be developing a comprehensive proposal for the outreach program. If we secure funding, you'll lead the program implementation. Even without funding, the coordinator position represents a step up from your current role," Mrs. Henderson added. "Increased responsibility, better compensation, and the opportunity to shape how County General serves our community." Darlene felt a wave of relief and excitement wash over her. "I accept, absolutely." "There's one more thing," Dr. Martinez said with a slight smile. "The letter from young Miss Williams mentioned her interest in learning about helping people. Would you be open to incorporating a youth education component into the outreach program, teaching children about health and wellness, maybe even basic first aid?" "I think that's a brilliant idea," Darlene replied, already envisioning Zora's excitement about such a program. Children often learn faster than adults, and they can become advocates for healthy practices in their families. As the meeting concluded with handshakes and congratulations, Darlene realized that by choosing to stay, she hadn't sacrificed career advancement. She'd found a different kind of advancement, one aligned with her values and interests. The drive back to Maple Street felt different than any drive she'd taken in months. Instead of the usual exhaustion after hospital meetings, she felt energized and purposeful. She had work to do that mattered, a community that valued her, and friends who supported her choices. She found Earl and Zora exactly where she'd left them, in the garage with the door open despite the drizzle, working together on what appeared to be a small wooden birdhouse that Earl was helping Zora assemble. "How did it go?" Zora asked the moment she spotted Darlene, setting down her tiny hammer with barely contained excitement. "Well," Darlene said, unable to suppress her grin. It turns out the hospital board was very impressed with a certain 7-year-old's letter. Really? Really. In fact, they were so impressed that they offered me a new position here at County. General, Community Health Coordinator. I'll be developing programs to bring healthcare directly into neighborhoods like this one. Earl stood up, his face breaking into a wide smile. That's wonderful news, Darlene. Congratulations. But that's not the best part, Darlene continued, looking directly at Zora. Dr. Martinez wants to include a youth education component in the program. Teaching children about health and wellness, basic first aid, maybe even some simple medical concepts. Zora's eyes went wide. You mean I could really learn about the helping people part? For real. For real. If you're interested, you could be our first student volunteer. Help us figure out what kids your age want to know and how they learn best. Could I teach other kids about paying attention and speaking up when something's wrong? I think that would be perfect, Darlene replied. That might be the most important health lesson of all. Zora practically vibrated with excitement, then suddenly grew serious. Miss Darlene, does this mean you're really staying? Like, definitely staying? Definitely staying, Darlene confirmed. I have a nameplate being made for my new office and everything. The garage erupted in celebration, with Zora doing a little dance around her workbench and Earl applauding. But after a moment, Zora stopped and looked thoughtful. You know what this means? She said. What? Both adults asked. It means we fixed something really important together. Not a machine or a stethoscope, but a whole situation. We figured out what was wrong and we worked together to make it better. Earl chuckled. That might be the most complex repair job you've tackled yet. And the most important one, Darlene added, because it involved fixing something in my life that I didn't even realize was broken. As they stood together in the garage, watching the rain ease up and patches of sunlight begin to break through the clouds, all three of them understood that something significant had been accomplished. Not just Darlene's decision to stay, but the deeper recognition that families could be chosen, that careers could be aligned with values, and that sometimes the most important fixes were the ones that brought people together rather than taking them apart. So what happens now? Zora asked. Now I start developing the community health program, Darlene replied, and you start learning everything you can about helping people. And your grandfather continues being the wisest man on Maple Street. And we keep being a family, Zora added matter-of-factly. Most importantly, we keep being a family, Darlene agreed. That afternoon, as news of Darlene's decision spread through the neighborhood, the garage once again filled with visitors, this time bringing congratulations instead of petitions. Mrs. Chen arrived with homemade cookies, Mr. Rodriguez brought flowers from his garden, and several of Darlene's colleagues from the hospital stopped by to express their excitement about the new program. Through it all, Zora moved among the adults with quiet confidence, explaining the petition process to anyone who asked, and sharing her plans for learning about community health. She'd found her voice and her purpose, and the combination was powerful to witness. As evening approached and the last of the well-wishers headed home, Darlene realized that the nameplate being made for her office would represent more than just a new job title. It would represent a choice to build a life around relationships and meaning rather than external validation. A choice to value belonging over advancement. A choice to recognize that the best healing happened in communities where people cared enough about each other to pay attention and speak up when something needed fixing. And it had all started with a 7-year-old who noticed a gas leak and cared enough to say something about it. 6 months later, on a warm Saturday morning in early May, the garage on Maple Street looked remarkably different, yet fundamentally the same. Earl's tools still occupied their familiar places, and the comfortable chaos of ongoing projects remained, but new additions reflected the changes that had taken root over the winter and spring. A small desk sat in one corner, equipped with medical, reference books and educational materials for the youth health program that had officially launched 3 months earlier. Zora's red toolbox had been joined by a matching medical kit, filled with practice stethoscopes, blood pressure cuffs sized for children, and anatomical models that helped her teach other kids about how their bodies worked. On this particular morning, Zora was preparing for her biggest project yet, leading a health and safety workshop for 12 neighborhood children, ages 6 through 10. She'd been planning the session for weeks, with guidance from both Earl and Darlene, but today she would be the primary instructor. "Remember," Earl said, as he helped her arrange folding chairs in a circle, "the most important thing is to make sure everyone feels comfortable asking questions. And don't try to cover too much material in one session," Darlene added, setting up a display of basic first aid supplies. "It's better for them to really understand a few concepts than to be overwhelmed with information." Zora nodded seriously, reviewing her notes one final time. At 7.5, she'd grown in confidence and knowledge, but she still approached new challenges with the same methodical preparation that had always characterized her work. The children began arriving at 10 o'clock, some accompanied by parents who lingered to observe this unusual educational experiment. Mrs. Chen brought her 6-year-old grandson, Mr. Rodriguez, arrived with his twin daughters, and several other neighborhood families gathered to see what Zora had planned. "Welcome to Garage Health Academy," Zora announced once everyone had settled into their chairs. "Today, we're going to learn about paying attention to our bodies and helping each other stay safe and healthy." She started with the most basic concepts: how to recognize when someone might need help, the importance of telling a trusted adult when something seemed wrong, and simple ways to comfort someone who was scared or hurt. Her approach was practical and concrete, using examples the children could relate to and demonstrations they could practice. "Who can tell me what we should do if we see someone fall down and get hurt?" she asked. Several hands shot up, and the answers ranged from get a grown-up to give them a bandage. Zora nodded at each response, then guided them toward a more comprehensive approach. "All of those are good ideas," she said. "But the very first thing we should do is check if the person is awake and talking. If they are, we can ask them what hurts and how we can help. If they're not awake, we need to get help from adults right away," she demonstrated with a volunteer, showing how to speak calmly to someone who was hurt, how to look for obvious problems like bleeding or difficulty, breathing, and when to go for help versus when to stay with the person. "The most important thing," she emphasized, "is to pay attention and care enough to help. Sometimes that means doing something, and sometimes it means getting someone who knows more than we do." Earl watched from his folding chair with immense pride as his granddaughter guided the children through scenarios and demonstrations. She'd inherited her mother's gift for teaching and healing, combined with her own natural mechanical intelligence and her grandfather's practical wisdom. Darlene observed from the garage entrance, equally amazed by how naturally Zora had taken to teaching. The child had been instrumental in developing the curriculum for the youth program, contributing insights about how children learned best and what concepts were most important for their age group. "Now," Zora continued, "let's talk about something really important. The difference between emergencies and regular problems, and how we can help with both kinds." She pulled out the stethoscope she and Darlene had repaired months earlier, now polished and functioning perfectly. "This is a tool that helps nurses and doctors listen to people's hearts and breathing. Miss Darlene and I fixed it together, and now she uses it to help patients at the hospital." The children were fascinated by the stethoscope, taking turns listening to their own heartbeats and learning about the difference between normal and concerning sounds. Zora explained how paying attention to details, like unusual sounds or someone, Acting differently than normal could help identify when someone needed medical attention, but you don't have to be a doctor or nurse to help people, she emphasized. Sometimes the most helpful thing you can do is notice when something's wrong and care enough to tell someone who can help. She shared the story of noticing the gas leak under Darlene's car, carefully explaining how her grandfather's lessons about mechanical safety had helped her recognize a dangerous situation. The children listened with rapt attention, understanding, for the first time, that their own observations and actions could genuinely help protect others. "Questions?" Zora asked as the formal presentation concluded. A hand shot up from Tommy Rodriguez, one of the 8-year-olds. "What if you're not sure? If something's really wrong? What if you think maybe there's a problem but you're not sure?" It was exactly the kind of thoughtful question that demonstrated these children were truly understanding the concepts. Zora smiled. "That's a really smart question, Tommy. If you're not sure, it's always better to ask for help and be wrong than to not ask and have someone get hurt. Adults would rather check on something that turns out to be okay than miss something that could be dangerous." Another hand went up, Lucy Chen, the 6-year-old. "Can kids really help save people like you did with Miss Darlene?" "Kids can absolutely help save people," Zora replied confidently. "Not by doing surgery or giving medicine, but by paying attention, by caring about others, and by being brave enough to speak up when they notice something wrong." As the workshop concluded and parents began collecting their children, many stopped to thank Earl and Darlene for organizing the program. Several asked when the next session would be held, and a few inquired about advanced workshops for older children. "This is remarkable," Dr. Martinez observed. He'd stopped by to see the program in action, curious about this unusual collaboration between a hospital, a retired mechanic, and a 7-year-old teacher. "Zora has a natural gift for education. Have you considered developing this into a larger curriculum?" "We're working on it," Darlene replied. "The hospital board has approved funding for a formal youth health advocates program. Zora will be our first certified instructor once she completes some additional training." As the garage emptied and they began cleaning up the workshop materials, the three of them reflected on how far they'd all come since that first afternoon when Zora had noticed something wrong with Darlene's car. "You know what I realized today?" Zora said, as she carefully packed away the stethoscope. "Teaching other kids about helping people feels just as good as fixing a broken machine. That's because both involve taking something that isn't working properly and making it better," Earl observed. "Whether it's a mechanical problem or a knowledge problem, the satisfaction comes from solving it." Darlene nodded. "And both require the same basic skills: attention to detail, patience, willingness to try different approaches until you find what works. Plus caring enough to stick with it even when it's hard," Zora added. As afternoon faded into evening, they found themselves sitting in their familiar triangle, Earl in his folding chair, Darlene on her milk crate, and Zora cross-legged on the floor. The garage had become much more than a workspace. It was the heart of a chosen family, a community learning center, and a place where the practical art of fixing things had expanded to include healing relationships and nurturing dreams. "Miss Darlene," Zora said thoughtfully, "do you remember that first day when I told you about the gas leak? I remember everything about that day. I was scared you might think I was just a kid who didn't know anything important. And instead, you taught me that some of the most important knowledge comes from paying attention and caring enough to act on what you see." Earl smiled at both of them. "Your mama would be so proud," he said to Zora. "Not just of what you've learned, but of who you're becoming. What do you think she'd say about all this?" Zora asked, gesturing around the garage with its mixture of mechanical tools and medical equipment, educational materials, and neighborhood memories. Earl considered the question carefully. I think she'd say that the best way to honor someone's memory is to carry forward the things they believed in. Your mama believed in helping people, in paying attention to what they needed, and in never being too busy or too important to care about others. And she'd probably say that healing happens in all kinds of places, Darlene added, not just hospitals and clinics, but wherever people choose to take care of each other. As the sun set over Maple Street, painting the garage in warm golden light, 3 generations sat together, contemplating the lessons they'd learned about family, friendship, and the power of noticing when something needed fixing. They'd discovered that the most important repairs were often the ones that brought people together rather than taking them apart, and that sometimes the smallest acts of attention and care could change everything. The repaired stethoscope sat on Earl's workbench, a symbol of what could be accomplished when different kinds of knowledge came together in service of helping others. Tomorrow would bring new projects, new students, and new opportunities to practice the art of paying attention and caring enough to act. But tonight, in the quiet of a garage where wisdom was passed between generations and miracles grew from the simple decision to notice when someone needed help, 3 people who had chosen to be family sat together, grateful for the second chances that had brought them into each other's lives and excited about all the fixing and healing that still lay ahead.